Welcome to the Master Your Marriage podcast. Today, we are talking about why therapy often falls short and what actually creates lasting change. If you've ever worked in therapy before, you've probably looked at some of your patterns. You may have even processed some old pains or learned new strategies for managing your relationship. Many people, however, find that after therapy, there is still a disconnect in their ability to respond differently when conflict arises or when they get triggered.
Yeah, the funny or not so funny thing is they leave therapy with more knowledge, but when something stressful happens in their marriage or relationship, the old reaction still takes over before they can access or use what they've learned.
Even with all of these newfound learnings and insights, they continue to get pulled into the same painful dynamics with their partner.
Yep,
They still find themselves reacting in ways that, we later regret.
always.
And over
Always.
time, they start to feel discouraged. They begin to wonder if there's something just fundamentally wrong with me, or maybe change isn't even possible.
So does this sound familiar? I would guess that it probably does. Most of us have been there, and well, we've been there for sure.
For sure.
And it's not usually a sign that the person is resistant to change or that the therapist wasn't skilled. It just reveals how well the individual increased their capacity to respond differently in stressful moments. So why is there a gap between the knowing and the doing? Well, most of us have a very passive relationship with our own emotional and relational lives. We hope that if we understand our patterns well enough, something will eventually shift on its own. And we sometimes treat personal growth like something that happens to us over time rather than something we actively participate in creating.
So I can give you kind of a funny example of this in myself. I spend a surprising amount of time watching weightlifting content on Instagram.
Surprising.
I don't think Robert knew this. I probably watch at least 4 or 5 reels a day of women in their 40s and 50s who are lean and strong and have the exact body that I want, right? The toned legs. And I understand a lot of what goes into that, the movements that it takes, the proper form, what the techniques look like. And then when I get to the gym, I just stand there and stare at the equipment and I feel completely frozen and dumb. And even though I've consumed quite a lot of information, I still feel awkward and unsure of what to do with my body when I get into those moments. So this is a real thing, not just in relationships. It's a real thing. There's a real gap between taking in information and then being able to actually use that information, especially when it matters the most.
Yeah, and that goes for just about anything in any walk of life, anything that you're learning. It's the difference between knowledge and doing, right? And this same gap shows up powerfully in our emotional lives. We can have a lot of knowledge about why we get defensive, why we shut down, or why we overfunction. But when we're triggered, that insight usually just goes out the window and disappears. That's why so many people feel like therapy, quote, didn't work. The therapy helped them understand themselves better, but it didn't necessarily build the capacity to respond differently when they were activated and triggered.
So what is the missing piece?
Oh, tell us.
The missing piece is that there are actually 3 different parts of you that are involved when you get into conflict, when you get activated. So one of the most helpful ways to understand why this happens comes from the work of Terry Real and Relational Life Therapy. And he describes 3 different parts of ourselves that show up at different times. And when we begin to recognize these different parts, a lot of these struggles that we have start to make more sense.
The first part of us is what's called the wise adult. This is the mature part of you that is in the here and now as you're listening to this episode. It is the part of you that can slow down and observe what's happening without immediately reacting. The wise adult is capable of taking in new information, pausing, and then choosing how you want to respond. The wise adult is connected to our prefrontal cortex. That is a part of your brain responsible for executive functions, perspective taking, and thoughtful decision making. Your prefrontal cortex develops last, unfortunately, and it's not even fully matured until around age 26, which is why I like to say that after age 25 and 26, our children actually like us.
Well, and if you put that into context, like when we got married, you were 26 and I was 19.
Yeah.
So your brain might have been fully mature, maybe. Mine, not even close, right? So no wonder we had so many
That
issues.
explains the first 6 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the next part of you that shows up in these conflict situations that Terry Real talks about is called the wounded child.
I recognize this child.
Okay. This is the young, vulnerable part of you. It's the part of you that carries old pain. It carries your fear, shame, and your old unmet needs from early in life. And according to Terry Real, our wounded child part often comes from the first 4 or 5 years of our life. When I explain this to couples that I'm working with, a lot of people will say things like, I don't like to play the blame game. And I
Yeah.
don't like to blame my parents for all of my adult problems. I don't really want to get into my childhood stuff. And I get that. I find that I have to give my parents a lot of grace, and I know that they did the best that they knew how. And yet they were human and they were deeply flawed. And children often do get hurt because they're being raised by flawed individuals. And it's important to keep in mind that these wounds that we have from our early childhood don't just happen from really big T traumas. In fact, psychotherapists largely agree that trauma isn't always about a single catastrophic event. More often, it's the slow buildup of hundreds, maybe thousands of small moments that can be equally damaging to young children.
So maybe you had a parent who constantly told you that you were a burden, or maybe they just sent signals that your emotions were just way too difficult for them to handle. Maybe you had a parent who was walled off. Maybe they were intrusive or just controlling. Or maybe you just had a parent who was totally checked out. Now, I want you to think about your own childhood for a moment. Were you physically, emotionally, and intellectually nourished? I wasn't. Were you cuddled, read to, or taught how to understand? And here's the important part: how to understand and regulate your complex emotions?
No.
No. Did you have someone who you could turn to when you were hurt or scared or sad? Maybe. Someone who helped you navigate these vulnerable moments?
Not really.
Not often. Or were you left to figure it out on your own like many of us did? And most of us didn't have these parents. And sad to say, I don't know that we were those parents early on in our career.
So this isn't the blame game. I think we learn to give a lot more grace when we become parents and we realize that as parents, we've not been perfect either. And so it's not about blaming. It's just acknowledging that despite our best efforts, our parents often come up short. And that is what creates the wounded child. So the wounded child is this part of us that gets activated. And when it gets activated, the feelings can feel really overwhelming and raw. And it's the part of us that wants to be protected, wants to be seen, wants to be soothed, wants to be defended.
And then there's the third part. And this part sits between the wounded child and the wise adult. Terry Real calls this part the adaptive child. Now, the adaptive child is this automatic, survival-based part of you. It's the part that is adapted to something, and by adapting and developing strategies, it helps you cope with your early environment. They were strategies that helped you navigate your family system, stay safe, and get your needs met. And sometimes these strategies helped you avoid pain. And over time, these strategies became what I like to say hardwired in your nervous system and became your way of relating to others.
So, like Robert said, this is the part of you that adapted and kind of came in and adapted to that wounded part. So some people also call this the protector part.
Yeah.
It adapted to something. It adapted to your environment. And you've heard of the fight, flight, or fixed response, right? When that happens, that's when your adaptive child tends to take over. And this switch happens very quickly. And usually your response is disproportionate to the situation.
One of my favorite stories that Terry Real shares is the story about Dan and Julia. So Dan isn't a bad guy. He's actually a great guy, but he's evasive. And whenever he gets slightly uncomfortable, man, he gets slippery and he starts dodging the truth. So in their first session, Terry Real asked Dan, "So who tried to control you growing up?"
And Dan was really quick to respond. He's like, well, it wasn't my father. He was totally checked out, totally passive. He was barely ever even there.
So Terry then says, "So your mother ruled the roost, right?"
Yeah. Yeah, Dan said, with an iron hand.
So Terry asks him and he leans in. He's like, "So then she ruled you?"
Well, Dan kind of shrugged it off. I was a really good actor and I put up a really good front.
So Terry then asked Dan, "What was behind this front that you put up?"
Oh, nothing disastrous or anything. Maybe girls, a little drinking, maybe some weed, but She never knew. She never knew. What you don't know can't hurt you, right? Well, that was it. There it was. That was his adaptive child's strategy. Remember, it's that part of us that had to adapt to something. And his was to evade, to lie, to bend the truth, because that's what was safe for him growing up. And so that was his adaptive child's strategy to deal with his mom, his controlling mother who was intrusive.
Now you're starting to see how brilliant the adaptive child is. It
Mhm.
comes up with strategies to protect this wounded child and help you survive your environment. That little boy was really smart to come up with his very own strategy. But the strategies that we adapt and learn and wire in at age 12 become maladaptive and destructive in our adult relationships.
Yeah. And this really matters because many adults spend a large percentage of their life operating from their adaptive child rather than their wise adult. I think some people walk around in their adaptive child the majority of the day.
And it can serve them,
It can.
but
In fact, I think I've had people say to me, I don't know why it is I can be so successful in my career, but then at home, I'm such a disaster. Why can I be so successful in my career? Because honestly, the adaptive child functions sometimes really well in the workplace. But when that part of us is running the show in our relationship, it's a disaster. And when you start to look at the difference between the adaptive child and the wise adult, it becomes really clear why the adaptive child doesn't function well in the relationship. So the adaptive child is rigid rather than flexible. It's harsh rather than understanding. It's perfectionistic rather than being able to appreciate the human frailty. It's relentless rather than forgiving. It's focused on the self and very me centric rather than us centric.
and it makes sense when we use the word child to think about that
Hmm.
because we wouldn't expect a child to be anything other than me centric.
Right.
Wouldn't expect a child, especially as they're adapting to their environment, to be anything other than kind of self preservation mode.
Exactly.
So, coming back to the question, why doesn't the change that we learn about and read about stick?
Mm.
The reason knowledge often fails to create lasting change is because the learned strategies of the adaptive child are deeply hardwired. When something touches a sensitive spot, that part takes over before the wise adult even has a chance to come online or intervene. So we move from trigger to reaction so quickly that there's almost no space for the wise adult to enter the picture. Or
Mm.
maybe in the terms of our kids these days, the wise adult has left the chat.
Right. So this is why people can do years of really good therapy and feel like they've made progress and then get pulled right back into old patterns the moment something activates them.
But there is a solution. There is a way forward. You don't have to live the rest of your life like that, leaving a trail of relationships in your wake. You can have a cherishing relationship.
So in therapy, you might hear the phrases top down approach or a bottom up approach. And I want to explain what those mean. So a top down approach in therapy focuses primarily on skills. It teaches skills and it's teaching skills to the wise adult. And this would be things like communication techniques and how to give a great apology or how to use love languages. These are great things and they can be really helpful, but only when the wise adult is actually online and available. The downside is obviously that the moment the adaptive child takes over, those skills are forgotten or they're inaccessible to us because they're in the prefrontal cortex that goes offline. And the person then reverts to their old, deeply hardwired, as Robert said, strategies without even realizing it. So once you're activated, again, the tools go out the window, the skills you learn go out the window.
And bottom up therapies focus heavily on healing the wounded child. This could be through processing trauma, inner child work, somatic work, basically any therapy where you're directly working with his early wounds. This type of work is important and very valuable, but there is a downside. Even once the original wound is healed, the adaptation doesn't necessarily disappear. Because these strategies were learned and reinforced over many, many years, they can continue to run even after the original pain has been addressed.
Yeah. So bottom up focuses on the wounded child, top down focuses on skills and teaching those to the wise adult. And you can see both of these approaches have limitations when you just use them in isolation. So our approach when we do coaching is confronting our role in the problem, and then focusing on the trauma and then on the skills. So it's kind of a combination of all of the above. One of the most important shifts, though, in this work is recognizing that recovery isn't something that's passive. It's not something that happens when we're just sitting in a therapist's office talking about our past or learning something new. Recovery happens in real-time present moments when we're triggered, when that old wiring is firing and screaming at us to do that old pattern, but we then decide to choose to do something different. That is where the recovery happens. That is where the healing happens.
And Terry Real often talks about what he likes to call the second consciousness. Second consciousness is the ability to observe when you're being triggered and activated without being completely taken over by the reaction. As Viktor Frankl wrote, between the stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response.
Or as Thomas Hubble puts it simply, to observe is to have choice. So when we can observe what is happening inside of us without immediately reacting, we begin to have options. We begin to have new choices available to us. And we can start to then shift out of the automatic flooded state of the adaptive child and get back into a more grounded and choiceful state.
Yeah, the flooded state is really hard to get out of. But let me tell you the rest of the story about Dan, and then we'll get to the flooded part. So Dan was the evader, right? He was a little bit slippery. And a few weeks later, after this original story, Dan and Julia show up in Terry's office smiling and holding hands. And Terry says, wow, look at the two of you. You guys look happy.
And Dan says, you bet, we had a breakthrough.
So here's what happened. Julia had sent Dan to the grocery store with a short list of items. And true to form, Dan came home with almost everything except the milk. I've done that.
No milk.
Julia looked at the groceries on the table and said, where is the damn milk? And I love that.
And Dan says, in that moment, he says, every muscle in my body was screaming, just tell her they were out of milk. Just tell her they were out of milk. Just tell her they were out of milk, right? That's his old pattern. That's what his adaptive child would do when it felt threatened. But instead, he took a deep breath. He paused, lengthened that space between stimulus and response, and he did something truly heroic. He simply said, I forgot.
Oh, wow.
Breakthrough. And at that point, Julia actually burst into tears. And she told Terry, I have been waiting for this moment for 10 years.
Oh, my gosh.
So honestly, this is the work. And it's not day-to-day work. It's moment-to-moment work. And it requires actively practicing the skill of noticing when we've been taken over by our adaptive child, and then gently inviting the wise adult to come back online.
If you want to start building this capacity to have your wise adult come online, here's a simple and powerful practice that you can begin using today. So the next time you notice yourself getting reacted or flooded, try this. First, take a small pause by taking a slower intentional breath. You can use something as simple as the 4-7-8 breath method if that helps. Inhale quietly through your nose for a count of 4. Hold your breath for a count of 7, and then exhale for a count of 8. Repeat this maybe once or twice if you need to. And I like this pattern, and you can work on that breathing exercise, or I always say, just take a breath.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I hear that I'm telling myself that, take a breath. That means just inhale, blow out that tension, allow my wise adult to kind of reboot and come back online, and then make that decision.
And then perhaps you could even follow that up with a few questions and ask yourself these questions without any judgment. The first question, what part of me is running right now? Am I in my adaptive child, or is my wise adult actually available to me? And what does this part need right now? And what would my wise adult want to do differently in this moment?
You don't have to force a different response. You're simply creating space between your trigger and the reaction. And, don't worry if this practice feels a little bit awkward, or maybe it doesn't even really work at first. That's completely normal. Like any skill we try to learn, we generally suck at it first. But as we do more repetition, get more reps in, we practice it, we just get better. And the first time you do it might feel strange or even silly, but about the 1,000th time, you're going to get you're going to get pretty good at it.
Really good at it.
Yeah. So before we leave, I just wanted to share a story about Charlotte and I this week. We had been watching this sort of mini series. It was on Netflix.
Yeah, love story. The John F. Kennedy Jr. story.
Yeah. And while I know that it was mostly a work of fiction and they tried to recreate it, there were these moments where John and Carolyn, what was her last name in that one?
Bissett.
Yeah, Carolyn Bissett. So John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bissett really struggled in their relationship. And it was just hurtful. And I remember talking to Charlotte and I said, boy, I remember the days when, we weren't communicating day in and day out, sometimes for a week, not very well, and just spending time living these parallel lives without any interconnectedness. And what a lonely place that was.
Yeah.
And so I want each of you guys who are listening to know that that is why we do this work. We do this work and we want to share with you tools, because just even that little glimpse of seeing this fictional character brought me back to the times when we had been in that same struggle. And we've been in that struggle with you. We've been in the dirt. We've been to the point where, where they call it that marital hatred, where I loved her, but I did not like her. And I'm just so glad that we have found the light on the other side. And that's just with these tools and the skills that we just try to share with each of you.
So a little bit of homework for you this week that we want to invite you to do. I want to invite you to keep a short journal with you. This is your actionable information, right? Not just knowledge. This is your action steps right now. Keep a short journal with you for the next week or two. And every day, I want you just to note 1 or 2 moments when you noticed yourself slipping into your adaptive child. And then what triggered it? What triggered it, and what did it actually feel like in your body when you were in it? Can you see the difference? Can you start to spot it? Again, this is a journal exercise. You don't need to judge yourself for being in your adaptive child self. We all go there. I just want you to notice, because noticing, again, is where choice begins.
So I think that's a wrap for today's episode. And if this one hit home for you, I want you to know that struggling to create change doesn't mean that you're broken or that the previous therapy was a waste of time. It often means that we just need a little bit more time and attention towards building this moment to moment capacity.
So we're so grateful you spent this time with us today. If this episode was helpful, we would be grateful if you left a comment and a review and shared this episode with someone who might need to hear it today.
So remember, take care of each other this week. Put each other first. It's the small things done often that create the biggest impact.
Until next time.